Good afternoon. My name is Beau Brodbeck, Extension Specialist at Auburn University. The work I'm going to talk to you today was done in conjunction with Dr. Jason Gordon at the University of Georgia. This work is complementary to research that we've seen by David Bankston with the U.S. Forest Service, who over the past several years has written a series of papers about futuring forests. He recently published a piece in Arborist News discussing futuring work in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. Our work is not futuring, but rather seeks to understand the perspective of professionals who are actively engaged in the management of urban forests and urban ecosystems to understand their perspective about the future challenges, educational needs, and research that's needed in the field of urban forestry and arboriculture. As you know, there's a number of challenges that are emerging in the field of urban forestry. These relate to climate change, population growth, and associated urbanization, invasive pests, limited biodiversity. And there's been a number of research over the last few decades on these topics. However, there has not been a good look at getting an understanding of the practitioner's perspective, those people whose boots are on the ground and who are actively engaged in the management of those urban ecosystems. And it's important to understand their perspective, as they're the people who implement the practices and the research in the field. And understanding practitioners' opinions can help guide urban forest management, research, education, and possibly even future policy. We conducted semi-structured interviews. We asked people to respond to oftentimes the first ideas that came to their head as we asked questions in three primary areas. First was the influence of the research and people, organizations, and their profession. And then we also asked them to discuss the major issues and challenges in the near future, in the far future. And then we asked them to talk about the science that informs their profession and should inform their profession in the future. And then also to discuss the knowledge and skills that new professionals would need as they move into the future in the professional of arboriculture and urban forest management. We conducted interviews in August and September of 2009, and we tried to find a balance between different professional groups and types and various traits, both geographical, race, gender, and so on and so forth. We analyzed the data using a thematic analysis where we looked for emerging issues, trends, counter trends, and broad driving forces that shape the future of our industry. It's important to note this was not futuring work, and we were not trying to make generalizations about the entire population. Instead, we were trying to get some ideas from those practitioners who we interviewed about how they saw the future and what some of those challenges and needs might be. So let's consider some of the future trends that we saw. So when we asked them about challenges, almost unanimously we heard from most of them challenges related to climate. And they saw a lot of the challenges that you would expect with increasing storm frequency, droughts, heat, and they talked quite often about how they were going to select trees and managing trees with a lot of these challenges. And this idea of, what tree pallets they were going to use. The tree pallets that had been used in the past may no longer be suitable in the future. And there was this idea that some of them might become tree migration managers as trees migrate either, to further north as things get hotter and drier, that they were going to have to be thinking about new pallets and what types of trees that they would be planting. There was also some discussion that there was kind of this growing realization amongst the arboriculture community and really amongst the public as well that trees are an important part to dealing with climate change as it helps mitigate heat urban island effect. However, some of the people we interviewed noted that as a profession, a lot of them haven't really started having a conversation about climate change and what the role of a lot of these professionals is, and acknowledging that really their decisions could make a difference and could have some big impacts. And it was this idea that we are at the forefront of this, and we really need to look at our decisions differently than maybe we have been in the past, and keeping the status quo might not be what is really needed. The other big issue that came up over and over again, and almost across the board, was challenges related to workforce. There was this realization that right now there's shortages in workforce, and it was anticipated that those shortages would not get really any better. And it was kind of this idea of who's going to fill these positions, especially when there's a perception that these jobs are not easy jobs. They're out in inclement weather. It's hot. They can sometimes be physical, and that workers have a perception that these jobs are hard and there might be easier ways to make a living. One commercial arborist was concerned about maybe even things like immigration policy, as we're seeing increasingly Latin American workers entering the workforce in urban ecosystem management. Another big concern was related to professionalism. This idea that the urban foresters, the utility foresters, the commercial foresters were oftentimes not seen by the public as professionals. They were still seen as people that ran chainsaws, drug brush, cut down trees, and were not seen as the professionals that a lot of them are, managing complex ecosystems, selecting the right trees, making the management decisions as to where to place trees, what species, and how to keep those forests healthy and resilient. And so there was this idea that within the industry, they needed to figure out how they could elevate how the public perceives them, how people within the industry perceives them, and how they can become increasingly viewed as the professionals that many of them are, as they're a relatively new profession when we consider it compared to natural resource management. And the third major concern and challenge that came up that many of them discussed was invasives. And so we know that they talked about how we're seeing increasingly issues with invasives, whether we're talking about pests or whether we're talking about plants, that invasives are a major challenge, even to the point where one person said, we might be in a place in the future where we have to actually hire somebody whose sole job is to deal with invasive plants. But there was also this idea of how do we reconcile the movement of plants and importation of exotic plants that really, between different schools, landscape architecture and horticulture, there hasn't been, sometimes they said, some reconciliation about, what are invasives, what are natives, what plants should we be planting, what is good diversity, how do we combat the impacts of this globalizing economy. So invasives were very much on people's minds, very much of concern of how they were going to deal with this, and they saw this as being an increasing challenge as we move into the future. Now, we also asked people to think about technology and what technology was going to be important in the field of arboriculture and urban forest management. And we heard a lot of things. Of course, increasing mechanization was discussed quite often, as it would look more and more like maybe logging type operations. And as you'd expect, a lot of people talked about geospatial technology, ways that we could increase the efficiency of how we inventory urban forests to get information on the structure, distribution, ecological and economic values. iTree was discussed as one of the major breakthroughs in how technology would need to continue to build on that model to make it easier, cheaper, less labor to get the information that a lot of managers needed to more effectively manage urban forests. There was also ideas related to technology about tree selection, that we might not just go to cultivars, but we might start actually getting it down to the DNA level, finding trees that are resistant to certain types of pests, that are more tolerant to certain types of stresses, and that even one person suggested we might move to this idea of organic forests, organic urban forests, kind of like we've seen in the movement to agriculture where a lot of our food production is now organic. That one person said, well, we might have this movement where your landscapes now might be organic, and we might select things that are very local, that are based to your neighborhood, that are based to your region. And so kind of that combination of, very locally produced urban plants. And so a lot of ideas with technology, and those were some of the big ones. We also talked to them about what science would influence the future. And across the board, there was discussion that there was a need for better science, and that in a lot of ways our industry was behind. There was two quotes that kind of really reflected this. And this is not to overlook the major accomplishments that we've seen in the field of urban forestry, but there was kind of this idea that we've had this cookbook approach that a lot of times there's been some groundbreaking research that is conducted, but then you have this cycle of 20 years where really nobody does any new research. The research that's there is kind of taken as gospel. Nobody really questions it. And so there was this idea that, when we train technicians, it's great to have trained technicians, but we really need to have professionals that really kind of question new research, can start being more critical of it and look at where our needs are in the field rather than just accepting the science that we have and taking it as gospel. And also there was this idea that we need to be less siloed with the research, that, horticulture and forestry, landscape architecture, engineering, that there needs to be less silos and it needs to become increasingly more multidisciplinary to address a lot of the multidisciplinary challenges that are emerging in the urban forest. And so this kind of brings us into this disciplinary boundaries discussion. When we asked them, what are some of the disciplines? Do you see this being in one discipline or two disciplines? And we really kind of saw things 50-50 split. There was this idea that, there'd be a blurring of the lines, that you would see increasingly the urban planner assuming some urban forestry skills and the urban forester assuming some planning skills. And so there was a group that kind of felt that way. But then there was another group that said, there's just way too much information. I don't know how you could. Instead, it's going to become increasingly specialized. You're going to have people that are going to have to become more specialized as our body of knowledge grows, and we start having people that might be, very much focused on maybe just tree risk assessment or certain types of pests or invasives, or dealing with some of the engineering challenges or the utility challenges as it relates to maybe wildfire and the conflicts between fire, trees, and utilities. And so we saw this idea that there might be, this split. Some people said there might be some blurring. Some people thought, it's going to be increasingly specialized. And so then we asked them about what the educational needs would be for future urban foresters. And often thoughts about education were intertwined with opinions about a disciplinary trajectory of the profession. And there tended to be agreement that the future professionals needed a broader and more well-rounded education in order to be prepared in the field. For example, I had someone from a major utility company tell me that they wanted people with knowledge of tree care, but who maybe also had some knowledge in engineering or green engineering, as they needed people who understood both of those worlds, at least maybe just a grasp of it. We saw that similar with people maybe with urban planning. We also saw that a lot with management. Maybe they needed some understanding of some financial understanding, some human dimensions understanding, because increasingly there was this idea that, urban forestry is about people management, not just tree management. So you needed people that were very good communicators, had good interpersonal skills, came up time and time again from a lot of the managers that we interviewed. They needed people that were well-rounded, that could talk well, communicate well, but also had some grounded knowledge in some of the different areas that they were going to be working in. So in conclusion, as we look at some of the major points that really came up, the first, climate was viewed as a major issue. I think it's an opportunity for some researchers there is interest from the public. It's an opportunity to engage with some of these professionals in the field. They're also very hopeful of advanced technology from disciplines outside of horticulture and forestry. So it's kind of right for some other disciplines to come in. There was also some common trends in the opinions that new professionals, especially those who would become managers, would need a broader education than what was currently provided at colleges and universities. There was this kind of call that for, four-year college degrees and maybe even beyond that was needed. But there was also recognition that you also needed, people with 2-year degrees. And so there's going to be kind of this balance of, who needs to be in 2 years degrees and who's in 4. There was also this idea of diversity and inclusion applies to urban natural resource management. Like all areas of natural resource management, there is an assumption that urban brings in more diversity, But with the exception of Hispanics, this does not necessarily appear to be true. And there is a strong concern about the disproportionate distribution of tree cover based on race and income. And there has been very little discussion about the procedural justice of urban tree planting efforts, maintenance, and decision making. With that, thank you very much.